Awesome. Well, hello. My name is Grant Jordan. I'm the CEO of SkySafe. We're a drone defense company, startup out of San Diego. So I want to talk about a couple things today. One is a little bit about SkySafe and what we do and what it means as far as drone defense and airspace management. Two, a little bit about FAA drone regulations as they've been evolving and kind of what the future looks like there, if you're trying to think about doing drone stuff. And three, also talk a little bit about DoD contracting and kind of the DoD acquisition world and how startups can engage with that, because I know that can be sort of an intimidating environment. So a little bit about our team. The four founders and I, three of the four of us, we were classmates at MIT together. After that, I was an Air Force officer for 4 years, working in the Air Force Research Lab. So I was doing things with small UAVs and counter IED sensor systems, looking at those sorts of things. After the Air Force, my co-founders and I started a security consulting company. So we were doing a lot of reverse engineering, vulnerability analysis, doing a lot of hardware security kind of stuff. And that's where we saw this sort of the rise of these threats in the drone space of, you know, the availability of drones and kind of their real high capabilities. And in that world, I mean, there's a lot of amazing potential of drones. There's a lot of great things they can do. And there's also a lot of concerns in a lot of areas. Prisons, airports, critical infrastructure, things like that are really worried about what are the drones in the airspace, what can they do about it, how can they use drones to do things like inspection, but also control what drones can and can't be there. So that's really where we come in. The military has seen a lot of problems with this. They're kind of at the forefront of seeing the threats involved. So these are videos you probably saw of ISIS using off-the-shelf DJI Phantom 4s, dropping 40mm grenades on Iraqi security forces. So our first main customers have been the military. They're super concerned about these kinds of things and what can happen in the field. So a little bit about us. You know, we started in 2015. We've raised about $15 million total in funding. We had a first contract with the DoD, which was $1.5 million, and I'll talk a little bit more about that process. And we currently have systems deployed with the Navy. So our focus is really airspace management beginning to end, right? So that's detection, identification, tracking, and intercept of any rogue drones that are in the area. In that, we do a lot of reverse engineering, signals analysis. Everything we do is software-defined radio. So our entire background and expertise is in the RF space. So we look at all of the signals coming from drones, whether that's control links, video signals, telemetry transmissions. So we try to classify what's in the air and where things are going to give any sort of airspace authorities an understanding of what's there, not just who's bad in the area, but who's good as well. Right? So we can identify individual drones. So drones can be whitelisted or authorized to be in the area, and then drones that aren't supposed to be there can be taken care of. So as I said, a lot of our background is in reverse engineering. So we pretty much look at every drone on the market. I often joke that we should start a spin-off company doing unboxing videos and drone reviews, because we look at every single one out there. So we have our own preferences as far as which one is the most amazing. But really it gives us that understanding from beginning to end, and it lets us do a lot of different effects on these drones. So this is the video on our website. You can see us taking down a DJI Phantom 4. Now the subtle thing about this video that a lot of people miss is that we're also filming it from a DJI Phantom 4. So we're having very specific effects on a single drone in the airspace and not interfering at all with another. And that's really the kind of thing that's critical in the long run, right? You need to be able to stop the people who are malicious or trying to do harm, but not interfere with all of the legitimate users in the area, all of the commercial aspects, all of the things that are authorized to be there. So that's where we focus really all of our intent. If people just wanted to block the airspace entirely, they could do that, but that wouldn't really be beneficial. You know, our whole goal is encouraging commercial drone use, allowing all of the awesome things that can be done with it. And that's really where kind of the state of drone regulation comes in. It's been moving along pretty well since we started in 2015. You know, the FAA really wants commercial drone use. They really want consumers to be able to use drones. But it's all about how do we balance all of the good things and prevent all the potential bad things, much like we've done in traditional aviation for a long time. So, we all want to be able to use drones for inspection and delivery and disaster response. Disaster response has become huge. I know, AT&T did a series of demos recently where they established network infrastructure in a disaster area using tethered drones, essentially as artificial, temporary cell phone towers. So that's huge. But then, operating in a disaster zone also means that they need to coordinate with authorities who are flying drones to try to recover people, to try to understand what's going on and not interfere with that. In California, we have tons of wildfires at this point, and it's been a constant struggle with CAL FIRE using their various, helicopters and tanker aircraft. Every time there is a big fire, there's people flying drones in the airspace, and they have to ground all these tankers and stuff. So they need to be able to know what's in the area before they can fly, and they need to be able to stop people that don't understand they can't fly there. So that's been a big thing. And obviously, these are things we can solve. So, in the industry, we've started to talk about 3 types of threats, the careless, the clueless, and the criminal. I think that pretty well encapsulates it. And most of the threats, most of the worries are not people who are trying to do harm. They're not people who are, trying to be malicious. A lot of them are just, well-meaning people who don't understand the impact that they can have. I'm sure folks, flying, taking really amazing wildfire videos would never believe that they would be stopping, actual firefighters from responding. So what do you need in the future? To make this all work as an infrastructure, you need a lot of things. You need remote identification, you need safety standards, you need education and certification of people who are flying in this airspace, just like you need that on the roads, just like, to drive a car, you need to take a test and have a driver's license. Pretty straightforward, just making sure everybody is educated and knows what's going on. You also need overall airspace awareness. So you need, much like an air traffic control system, understanding what things are in the air so that each person flying knows what else is there and how they can avoid them, and that everyone's safe. And you need enforcement tools for authorities to be able to take action if there are people explicitly trying to do harm so that they don't ruin it for everyone else. And that's pretty much what's been happening. Just last month, the Congress passed the FAA reauthorization bill, which started a lot of these things in motion. So it laid out a plan to enact remote identification for drones, to have drone pilots pass a basic safety test, knowledge test, things like that. And it also carved out authority for DHS and DOJ to take down drones that are endangering the public when they need to. So now federal law enforcement actually has authority to stop those things. So it's getting there. It's a long process, but the FAA does want all of these things. They're very serious about wanting to be able to encourage all the commercial use of drones, and they're making progress toward that. The next thing that I thought might be interesting to some of you is, how do you as a startup interact with the DoD? How do you engage in government contracts and things like that? And this is actually a subject near and dear to my heart as a former Air Force acquisition officer. The acquisitions process can be gigantic and scary, and it is. But a lot of people have been putting a ton of effort into acquisitions reform and in building processes that can allow startups to really engage with the government and have the DoD, connect with startups. So the big problem for the DoD is that technology is moving incredibly fast now. A lot of the threats that they're worried about no longer come from other countries, other governments. They come from the commercial space, and all of the cutting-edge technology also comes from the commercial space. So how can they tap into that, and how can they help encourage that and make things run smoothly? In the old system, right, you have the giant defense acquisition system, and it's all gigantic, multi-year contracts, millions and millions of dollars. Nobody gets out of bed for less than a $50 million contract over 5 years, right? But that obviously doesn't work for startups. That doesn't work for new technologies that are just popping out. So, and in the old system, this is actually the diagram of the old system. I don't know how many of you have seen that before. That is the entire defense acquisition framework. It's like my favorite chart in the entire world, because that chart encapsulates on any given defense system, that's like, it could be up to like 100 years on that chart. Because the entire right side is all of the operations and support until finally you've like thrown out all of the vehicles or jets or whatever. And in a world where you're building aircraft carriers and F-22s and things, these like 30-year development programs, this system makes sense, right? This system is what you have to build space shuttles and destroyers and things like that. But if you're talking about new technologies that startups are building, this obviously doesn't work. Just, the first little initial phase in this is probably a 2-year slice, right? Like your startup has already been a blip in history at that point. So what are the new systems they're trying to do? It's all about small, fast, nimble contract vehicles. It's about connecting directly with startups, and it's about connecting startups to the actual customers that are there. So in the old system, everything was thought of as requirements driven. So you would think about the DoD basically, sitting down, a bunch of people in a room and saying like, okay, what are the requirements of the thing we need someone to build, right? How fast does that plane need to fly? What are the radar, specifications? Now, it's not about defining exact requirements and just asking someone to build it. It's about saying, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And then putting that out to industry, and then having industry, having startups, having all of these new technologies really try to address that problem in ways that might not have been expected, right? They may not have been able to define the exact requirements when they were thinking about it. So that's more of what problem-driven or technology-driven kind of acquisitions is about. And it's a huge difference. But it also means that you, as the startup people, as the technology developers, it really puts the onus on you, right? Because it's not going to be the government that's going to come and say, build me this widget that does this exact set of specifications. They're going to say, solve me this problem, right? And so it gives you, it's a double-edged sword. You have both a ton of freedom to develop the technology that you think is the right solution, but also no one's going to tell you what the right solution is. And the DoD has established a number of organizations, the biggest of which is DIU, formerly DIUX. That's where we got our contract through. So, and to be clear, DIU and these other organizations, SoftWorks, AFWorks, MD5, there's like defense accelerators. These organizations are not your customer, right? They're just there to connect you with the actual customer, the actual operator in the field, the actual people that are experiencing that problem. But they're not the customer. They're just the ones facilitating these new types of contract vehicles, kind of getting things moving quickly and trying to make that happen. So, what do you do? How do you get involved? The first thing is connect with these sorts of organizations. DIU is huge, SoftWorks, AFWorks, things like that. Another thing I would say is, I can't express enough, deal with and talk to and connect with the real customers that are experiencing the problem. It's just like anywhere else in the startup space, right? You need to understand what your customers' problems are, what their pain points are, and how you can address that. And they'll really be your champions in the DoD, right? It's not going to be a random program manager in an office somewhere in the government. It's going to be the real people who are trying to field your solutions. They're going to be the ones that are pushing for it, and they're going to be the ones trying to build out these new contracts for you. The other thing that I would talk about is intellectual property questions, right? In the old model of defense acquisitions, the focus was really the government had to own everything, right? They had to own the IP and the rights to everything. And that made sense in the old system, right? Because in the old system, the government was the only one who would be funding this sort of technology development. They would be putting out all the money, all the risk. The beginning of that 5-year, $50 million contract would be, nothing would be built then, and then at the end of that 5 years, something would be delivered, right? So the government, it was all high dollar amount, high risk contracts. Now the difference is, it's really about the government leveraging the private sector, leveraging venture capital, and understanding that they can benefit from that kind of commercial market, right? So in our case, for example, right, we had the $1.5 million contract with the DoD, and then at the same time, we raised our Series A, which was $11.5 million, led by Andreessen Horowitz, right? So really what the government got was not $1.5 million worth of system development. What the government got was $13 million worth of actual effort, right, for only $1.5 million of taxpayer money. And so that's the kind of leverage that they're able to get in opening it up and thinking about this world kind of the way that startups operate, right? But the key there is that you should actually push back. And if the DoD tries to say, well, we should own all of the rights to this, you should say, you really shouldn't, right? Like, you should benefit from the private sector pushing on this. You should benefit from the other non-taxpayer money that's going to be involved in this. And you should kind of let us solve that problem for you. The other thing I would say, just briefly, is that in the world of DoD and defense, although it's a gigantic system, it's a very small world at a personal level. So everyone that you interact with, all of these customers, they all know each other, and you need to show them what's possible, and you need to also be totally open and totally honest with what your capabilities are. Because if you burn them once, there isn't another customer that's going to be totally unknown to you. They all talk, and they all know. And there's a lot of startups that have just promised the world and under-delivered and been totally burned in the entire kind of DoD, because everybody starts saying, like, hey, they don't deliver. So that's really the key, right, is working with those customers, working with those champions, and building a strong relationship with theirs so that they will advocate for you. And on the other side, on the startup side, on the VC side, you need to push on your VCs and educate them and make sure they understand the potential of that government market, of that military market, and how that can work, right? Not every VC firm is comfortable with thinking about government contracts and, oh my God, that's a gigantic system. How are you ever going to sell into that? How are you going to compete with the Boeings and the Raytheons and the Lockheeds of the world? And the answer is you really can, right? Because the giant incumbent defense contractors, they operate at an entirely different level. They're working in the old model system, right? They want to build out a $100 million contract for 5 years, and they're not going to start doing any R&D until that contract is signed, right? But you can operate totally differently. So that's the opportunity that you have. And with that, we'll open it up to questions. Yeah.
If there is like a passive, for example, you go on the program to go to a certain location, in your coordinates and turn back to the space. Can you detect it without RF, or you're detecting it on RF?
Right. So our focus isn't our focus is entirely RF. So that's all emissions whatsoever, and on the intercept side, that's all reception whatsoever. So just because it's autonomous doesn't necessarily mean it's non-emitting. But if it is totally non-emitting, that's kind of not our world, right? That kind of gets you back into what I would classify as like traditional air defense, right? Where you're probably talking radar, you're probably talking, things like that. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Just a two quick questions. One is testing. Are you testing any of these devices in urban centers, say like in Manhattan, for instance? And second one is, how long does it take these disaster contracts if you find government that it is at least 1 year to get compensation?
Yeah, so on the first one, most of our testing, all of our testing on the active side, on the countermeasure side, is entirely on DoD test ranges at the moment. On the passive side, on just monitoring stuff, that you can actually do in the real world in an urban environment. We're based in San Diego. We don't test in really dense urban environments, but yeah, the second question, getting paid by the government, totally depends. Totally depends on the contract vehicle. So, for instance, how it's often structured in like an OTA contract, like we had. So we had like a 1-year kind of contract, and in that there will be a series of milestones. And in each of those milestone deliveries, whether that's a delivery of a prototype or a demonstration or a report or whatever, there will be payment on that. And usually that payment occurs within, I want to say 30 days generally of that particular invoicing. So it doesn't necessarily have to be crazy. But it's something that does need to be figured out and negotiated in that initial contract construction.
Hey, first of all, thank you very much. Seeing a startup being able to sell to the community is very interesting. In the law enforcement space, there's always a question whether to find or buy a device that theoretically stop a car, because then the thought goes, well, the criminals will then use it against their police force. Same thing here, right? You have the ability to basically drop all the drones in the air in a certain area, kind of black mirror thing. Your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's always kind of a balance, right, in thinking about security. I mean, everything defensive could in some way be used by criminals in some way. You know, none of the things that we're doing are, I don't know. I don't think they're necessarily kind of leverageable on that side. And I mean, for us, it's all about you know, providing it to customers in a controlled way, to, you know, law enforcement, to military, things like that.
Okay, we need to keep things moving because we have another 3 speakers. Cool. But you're going to be around for a little while after this, right? So
I'm here. Awesome.
Right.
Thank you.
Grant, thank you so much.